The first sign of the apocalypse wasn't a scream, it was the rain. For 3 days in September of 9 AD, the sky over Germania didn't just open up, it turned black. The ground, usually solid enough for the rhythmic march of the world's greatest army, turned into a glue that swallowed men whole. We often think of the Roman Empire as a concept of marble and light. We picture the Colosseum, the straight roads, the Senate floor. We imagine the Roman legions as an invincible force of nature that rolled over the known world like a machine. But in this forest, the finest military engineering in human history was dismantled, not by a superior army, but by mud, trees, and a betrayal so deep it broke the psychology of an empire. When the silence finally returned to these woods, 3 entire legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, had vanished. They weren't just defeated, they were erased. The machine didn't just break, it was fed into a meat grinder. This wasn't a battle, it was a 3-day execution. And to understand how the masters of the world walked willingly into their own grave, we have to look at the one thing Rome couldn't engineer its way out of: its own arrogance. For centuries, Rome was a predator. It was a system of assimilation that turned chaos into order. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 9 AD, you have to look at the Roman legion not as a group of men, but as a piece of high-precision technology. It was the sound of civilization, the rhythmic stomp of iron-studded sandals on stone, the synchronized clattering of lorica segmentata armor plates. When a legion walked, the world trembled. They were designed for open fields, for clear sightlines, for shock and awe. They were a logistical supercomputer made of flesh and iron. Every soldier was a cog in this machine. They didn't fight as individuals, they fought as a wall. They were backed by a supply chain that stretched thousands of miles, engineers who could build bridges over the Rhine in 10 days, and a belief system that told them they were divinely ordained to rule. But in the autumn of 9 AD, that heartbeat stopped. Roughly 20,000 combatants, plus thousands of civilians, slaves, and camp followers, walked into the Teutoburg Forest. They were carrying the weight of the empire on their backs. This event was a system collapse. It was the moment the ancient world realized that their technology, their bureaucracy, and their engineering had a limit. To understand the panic, look at the Roman centurion. He is the backbone of the army, the enforcer of discipline. He relies on sight, on orders, on the structure of the cohort. But what happens when you take away his line of sight? What happens when you drown his orders in thunder? What happens when the ground beneath his feet betrays him? To understand how the most disciplined force on earth walked blindly into a slaughterhouse, we need to go back to the man who opened the gate. We need to go back to the illusion of control. The year is 9 AD. The man in charge of the province of Germania is Publius Quinctilius Varus. You have to remember, Varus wasn't a wartime general. He was an administrator. He was a lawyer. He was related to the Emperor Augustus by marriage. He had previously governed Syria, a place where the war was already won, where the population was subdued, and where the job was simply to extract wealth. He was sent to Germania not to conquer it. Rome believed that was already done, but to tax it, to turn it into a province. Varus believed the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was absolute. He looked at the Germanic tribes and saw subjects, not warriors. He imposed Roman law on a people who settled disputes with blood feuds. He demanded tribute in gold from a people who traded in amber and cattle. He was the arrogance of the system personified. He treated Germania like a garden that just needed a little pruning, unaware that he was standing in a jungle. But standing right next to him was the architect of his destruction, Arminius. To the Romans, Arminius was a success story. He was a Germanic prince of the Cherusci tribe, taken as a hostage in his youth. But hostage is a misleading word here. He was raised in Rome. He was trained in the Roman military. He was given Roman citizenship. He was a knight, an eques. He spoke fluent Latin. He knew the tactical manuals better than Varus did. He knew how the Romans marched, how they camped, And critically, he knew exactly what they feared. He was the perfect example of Roman assimilation. Varus looked at Arminius and saw a son. Arminius looked at Varus and saw a target. But Arminius was living a double life. While he dined at Varus's table, discussing philosophy and law, he was stitching together a coalition of tribes that hated each other. The Cherushi, the Bructeri, the Marsi. These tribes were historic enemies, united only by one thing: their hatred of the Roman tax collector. When the marching season ended, Varus prepared to move his massive column back to winter quarters on the Rhine. It was a routine administrative move, but then Arminius brought news of a small uprising to the northwest. It was a fabrication, a distraction designed to pull the Romans off the main highway and into the interior. Here is the tragedy of the situation. Varus was warned. Segestes, a rival Germanic chieftain and the father-in-law of Arminius, told Varus to his face that Arminius was a traitor. Segestes practically begged Varus to arrest Arminius. But Varus ignored it. He couldn't conceive that a Roman citizen, a man of his own staff, a man who wore the toga, would betray the system. He viewed Segestes' warning as petty tribal squabbling. He ordered the detour. This was the first fatal error. He committed roughly 20,000 combatants, plus women, children, servants, and heavy baggage trains, into territory that hadn't been scouted. He walked away from the river, away from the supply lines, and into the dark. You see, a Roman column on the march wasn't just a fighting force, it was a moving city. With the baggage train, the construction equipment, the livestock, and the camp followers, this line stretched for 15 to 20 kilometers. That is a crucial number. The head of the column was 4 to 5 hours away from the rear. Communication was impossible. If the front was attacked, the rear wouldn't know for half a day. The machine was stretched so thin that it became fragile. Varus thought he was marching through a province he owned. In reality, he was walking into a cage. The trap didn't spring all at once. It began with the terrain. As the Romans pushed deeper into the forest, the track narrowed. To understand the panic, look at the geography. This wasn't a road. It was a muddy path sandwiched between steep limestone hills to the left and the Great Bog, an impassable marsh to the right. The column was forced to thin out. Soldiers were separated from their units to help push wagons. The tight, impenetrable formations that made Rome invincible were dissolving into a long, disjointed line of angry, tired men. They were no longer a legion, they were a traffic jam. And then the weather turned. A massive storm system moved in. This wasn't just bad luck. In the ancient world, weather was the domain of the gods. To the superstitious Romans, this was an omen. To the Germanic warriors waiting in the silence, it was the signal. This is where the engineering failed. Roman shields, the scutum, were made of plywood covered in leather and hide, held together with animal glue. When soaked for hours, they became incredibly heavy. The wood swelled, the glue dissolved. A shield that was meant to protect you became a 50-pound weight dragging your arm down. Their offensive weapon, the pilum, relied on a wooden shaft fitting into an iron shank. The rain swelled the wood. The javelins became warped and useless. The mud sucked the caligae off their feet. The symbol of Roman civilization had become a burden. Then the attacks began. But this wasn't a battle line. Arminius knew he couldn't fight the legions in the open. He used the forest like a weapon. They struck the baggage train in the center. They hit the isolated rear guard. They threw javelins from the high ground and vanished back into the trees before the Romans could even form a line. Imagine the psychology of this. You are surrounded by trees. You can't see your enemy. Your armor is rusting on your body. You can't talk to your commander. The system of the legion relies on cohesion, on the person next to you holding the line. But there was no line. There was only mud and shadow. By the end of the first day, the Romans managed to build a camp, but the psychological damage was done. Arminius had left the column to join his people. The betrayal was revealed. Varus realized that his guide, his friend was his executioner. On the second day, they tried to break out. They burnt their wagons. They abandoned their supplies. They abandoned the wounded. They needed to reach the open plains where their formation could save them. But Arminius was always one step ahead. He knew exactly where they were going because he had planned the route. Archaeologists at Calcrates have found something chilling. The Germanic tribes hadn't just waited in the bushes. They had prepared the battlefield. They constructed turf walls along the narrowest point of the pass. This allowed the Germanic warriors to strike from above, protected by the wall, while the Romans were trapped in the kill zone below. This wasn't a chaotic ambush anymore. This was a system of industrial slaughter. Arminius had built a machine to destroy the machine. The Romans were funneled into a corridor less than 100 meters wide. On one side, the wall bristling with spears. On the other, the bog waiting to drown them. If you want to understand how fragile your world actually is, stick around, because what happens next is the total collapse of order. We are heading into the final act of the collapse. If you're enjoying this analysis of history's darkest moments, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. By the third day, the rain was torrential. The Romans were exhausted, starving, and terrified. They were no longer a legion, they were a mob. The Germanic warriors closed in for the kill. The Roman cavalry, led by a legate named Valor, tried to abandon the infantry and ride for the Rhine. They didn't make it. Arminius's horsemen hunted them down. The unity of the legion was gone. It was every man for himself. And Varus, the man who represented the authority of the emperor? He realized there was no escape. He knew what the Germanic tribes did to high-ranking captives. He knew he would be paraded, tortured, and sacrificed in the holy groves. So to avoid capture, he did what his father and grandfather had done before him in times of defeat. He fell on his sword. When the commanders died, the resistance ended. It became a massacre. The Roman historian Tacitus later described the scene. Whitening bones, scattered where men had fled, heaped up where they had stood and fought. The prisoners were not spared. The tribunes and centurions were dragged to altars in the forest and sacrificed to the Germanic gods of war. Their heads were nailed to the trees as warnings. The Roman eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, the very soul of the army, were captured. Fast forward to the news reaching Rome. It took weeks. When the report finally arrived, it shattered the Emperor Augustus. Suetonius tells us that Augustus was so traumatized he let his hair and beard grow for months. He would bang his head against the doorposts, screaming the now famous phrase, "Quintili veri, legiones rede." Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. But the legions were gone. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a geopolitical turning point. For the first time, Rome accepted that its expansion had a limit. The Rhine River became the border. Germania remained free. The dream of a completely Roman world died in the mud. 6 years later, the Roman general Germanicus marched back into that forest. He found the battlefield. He found the rusting armor fused with the tree roots. He found the skulls of the soldiers nailed to trees looking down at him. He found the altars where the centurions were bled out. The army gathered the bones of the men who had vanished into the silence and buried them in a massive mound. It was the funeral of the Roman offensive spirit. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest teaches us a brutal lesson. Systems, no matter how advanced, are vulnerable. Rome believed its engineering, its bureaucracy, and its tactics could tame the world. They believed they were immune to the chaos of nature. But in the end, the machine was destroyed by the very nature it tried to conquer. The silence eventually returned to the forest, but the scars on the Roman psyche never healed. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.